Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are starting a new unit. We are starting the unit on sensation and perception. It is a relatively small unit, but it's a really fun unit because we get to see all of the wild things that our mind gets to do with the information that it gets from the outside world. So to get started, let's go ahead and make sure that we understand the differences between sensations and perceptions. So what I want you to do to get started is I want you to look at this image that I have on the screen. I imagine that when you look at this image, you likely see a spiral, right? You believe that it is kind of spiraling inward toward the center. Well, the reality is that's not what you see, it's what you perceive. What you are seeing are circles. And you can test this yourself. You can pause the screen and you can pick any one of these lines and you can kind of follow it around. So I've got my mouse here and it's going around and it goes right back to where I started. And so the image on the screen is simply a series of circles like a dartboard. That's what you are sensing. Sensations are what is actually happening in the world. Sensations are the stimulation of sensory receptors, whether those sensory receptors are in our eyes, our skin, our mouth, our ears, you name it. A sensation is simply when those neurons are being stimulated. Then that information goes to the brain for interpretation. And your interpretation of that information is your perception. So when you look at this image, you perceive it as a spiral, even though that's not what actually exists on the screen. Most of the time, our sensations and our perceptions are pretty closely linked, but sometimes, like what we have on the screen, they don't match up. And these are illusions that we may experience. So, we're going to dive into today a lot of the aspects of what creates a sensation and what that looks like. We'll have a couple of lectures that go into detail about our sense of sight and our sense of hearing and our other senses. And then we'll round out the unit by talking about all of our different perceptions and how our mind makes sense of this information. So first, let's look at the process of creating a sensation. And it's kind of like a three-step process. So my video is covering up here. This just says brain there in the corner. So how does information go from the outside world and eventually end up in our brain? Well, it's a three-step process. First of all, remember from our last unit, we talked about neurons, and we talked about how neurons receive information and then they send it along the way. Well, that's what's happening here. We have sensory neurons that are stimulated by some kind of energy. We have sensory neurons, for example, in our eyes that are stimulated to light. We have sensory neurons in our ears that are stimulated to vibrations in the air, sensory neurons on our skin that are stimulated by things like pressure or by heat. So step one is simply the reception of that energy. Then the middle step, this is an important psych term for you to know, that middle step is what we call transduction. And transduction is when we take that external energy and we convert it into an electric message that our brain would be able to interpret. If we just shine a light on your brain, it doesn't know what to do with that information. If we just scream at your brain, it doesn't know what to do with that information. So the process of transduction is taking this external energy, such as sound waves or light waves or pressure, and converting it into an electric message that your brain can understand. Then the third step is getting it to the brain. It's the process of transmission. So it's taking that message and actually sending it to the central nervous system, specifically to the brain for processing. Now, something interesting can happen. Imagine for a moment that you are getting the same message received over and over and over and over again. So we look at this process of stimulating sensory receptors. Well, our brain is really interested in change. It's not so much interested in things that remain constant, which leads us to this interesting phenomenon that we call sensory adaptation. And my screen's not moving over here. There we go. Sorry. Sensory adaptation, this really interesting phenomenon where if you have the same sensation occurring over and over and over and over again, at some point, your brain doesn't need to know that. So think about a hot tub, for example. The first time you get into a hot tub, when you're kind of easing your way into the hot tub, that water might be, 101, 102 degrees. It's very hot. And you have sensory neurons all over your skin that is receiving that message of heat, and it's sending the message to your brain saying, hey, did you know you're in this really hot water? But then after a few minutes, you kind of quote unquote get used to it. Well, the water is not any cooler, 4 or 5 minutes later. It's not that the water temperature has changed. The difference is those sensory neurons on your skin, they stop sending the message because it's the same message that it's had over and over again, so it just stops sending the message. And then you perceive that you have gotten used to the temperature. This happens all the time, right? So I have a ring on my finger here. I don't feel this ring just like you likely don't feel your socks. You probably feel them right when you put them on, but then give it 30 seconds or so, your brain does not need to receive the message of, hey, did you know there are socks on your feet all day long? So we get used to it. The idea of sensory adaptation is when we stop sending sensory messages because the messages themselves haven't changed. So sensation, again, sending messages from the outside world to the brain. And then perception is, what do we do with it? Perception is a little bit more difficult to wrap our mind around. So this next slide is going to look at these two terms, what we call bottom-up and top-down processing. And there's a lot of information on this slide. I would highly recommend you pause this slide, get this into your notes, and then more importantly, listen to the explanation and add things to your notes. Because if you just have what is on the screen in your notebook, I'm telling you, a month from now, 5 months from now, it likely won't make any sense. Bottom up and top down processing are a little tricky. But here's what we're trying to get across with this slide, okay? A perception is not always just what we sense. Think about that for a moment. The way that we perceive information is not always simply the information that is sent to our brain. Now, part of our perception is, of course, those sensations, and that is what we call bottom-up. Bottom-up processing is essentially our sensations, right? The sights that we see, the sounds that we hear, the smells that we smell. These are our sensations that work from the bottom up. It's taking in sensory information. But that alone does not equate to a perception. A perception is then also how we think about that information. What we see, what we smell, what we hear. Have we experienced that before? Do we have memories of those sensations? What are our expectations? Do we expect to hear something or see something? Top-down processing is the way that we interpret and process the information that we are receiving from the outside world. And our perception is the result of these two things together. So I have on the bottom of the screen, bottom up plus top down equals perception. So I'm going to give an example. Imagine you and I go to a concert, and you and I could see the same musicians. We could hear the exact same songs. We could be around the same smelly people in this big crowded concert hall. And yet, despite the fact that you and I would be sensing the same things, we might perceive the experience very differently. Our bottom up would be the same. Our top down would be different because the way that we think about and interpret would be very different. If this is one of your favorite bands in the world, you might have lots of memories of these songs. You might have expectations for what the song's supposed to sound like. If it's the first time I'd ever heard of this group, I might not have those same thoughts. So our top down is different, meaning our perception would be different. So when we are creating a perception, think again, bottom up plus top down equals the perception that we have. Now, in our last unit, we talked about when neurons actually fire and what it takes for a neuron to fire. Maybe we are in a crowded room and there's people talking and you have much better hearing than I do. Well, you would likely perceive the conversation differently because my bottom up is different. The way that this sensory information is getting to my brain is different because I can't hear as well as you can. And so this leads us back to a conversation we had last unit about thresholds. When we talk about sensations, it's important to understand the concept of a threshold. Remember, a threshold is that minimum amount of stimulus required for a neuron to fire. I gave the analogy of a bucket filling up with water. And if you slowly fill the bucket up with water, at some point that bucket is going to tip over. Well, that's kind of like what we're talking about here. there's this term called absolute thresholds. And an absolute threshold, you can think of it as when nothing becomes something. If I am in a pitch black room, no light at all, and then you turn on this itty bitty tiny piece of light, maybe I can see it, maybe I can't. So you slowly increase the light and then some more. Now, light is technically in the room, it's technically going in my eyes, but it's just not enough for the neurons to see it, for the neurons to register it. The neurons don't fire. But at some point, right, if this is my threshold, at some point the amount of light is just enough that it crosses the threshold. Now I can see. Or you put on some headphones, right, and you turn the volume to 0, and then you press play, and then you increase the volume to 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, when you're doing that, there's technically music playing in your headphones, but you can't hear it. It's not above our absolute threshold. And then at some point, it'll cross the absolute threshold, and then all of a sudden, wait, okay, I can hear music now, right? So your absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus required for you to experience a sensation. Now, we can manipulate our absolute thresholds. We can actually lower our thresholds if we are expecting to experience something, if we are trained to experience something. And so this idea that we can kind of manipulate and lower our absolute thresholds is the concept of signal detection theory. If you are looking very carefully, trying to perceive something in the dark, you may notice it more efficiently or quicker than if you were not trained or expecting to see something. So signal detection theory, our ability to manipulate these thresholds. Now, absolute threshold is often confused with this next slide. And this next slide talks about difference thresholds. So with an absolute threshold, it's when nothing becomes something. When I can't hear anything, then all of a sudden I can, right? When I can't see anything, and then all of a sudden I can. A difference threshold is the smallest amount of change that we can actually detect. So we already are experiencing something. How much does it have to change before our brain recognizes, oh, this isn't the same anymore? So I got my coffee here, right? Now, maybe I have 1 packet of sugar in my coffee. Well, if I add just a couple of grains of sugar to my coffee here, I probably wouldn't be able to tell that there's more sugar in there, even though technically there is. The difference threshold would be if I've got 1 packet of sugar in my coffee, how much more sugar would I have to add before I can realize this is different, this has changed? If I'm in a room and the room is 70 degrees and then all of a sudden it's 72 degrees, it's technically warmer, but I probably can't tell the difference. How much warmer would it have to be before I can realize it's gotten warmer in here? That's the idea of the difference threshold. Now, absolute thresholds we can quantify. Like we can put a number on absolute thresholds saying this is the minimum amount of light that your eyes can detect. This is the minimum amount of sound that your ears can hear. That's your absolute threshold, and we can put a number on it. But difference thresholds are always relative. How much change is required before you can detect it? Well, it depends on how much of the stimulus was present in the first place. Think about this for a moment. If there was no sugar in my coffee and I added 1 packet of sugar, I would definitely be able to tell the difference. But I can't say that the difference threshold for sugar in my coffee equals 1 packet, because if I put 10 packets of sugar in here, first of all, gross, but if I put 10 packets of sugar in here and then I added 1 more, making it 11, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between 10 packets and 11 packets. So difference threshold is always relative to the initial stimulus. And this is what we call Weber's law. Yes, another W pronounced with a V. This is Weber's law. If the initial stimulus is grand, it's a big stimulus, then we need a big change in order to detect it. If you're listening to music at volume 40 and then it bumps up to volume 50, you'll probably detect the change. But if you're listening to music at volume 90 and then volume 100, maybe not, right? Because the initial stimulus is larger, we need a bigger change for us to be able to detect it. And then the last slide for us today, as we are talking about our ability to sense what is around us, recognize that we are bombarded with stimuli all the time. Think about all of the different sights and sounds and smells and things that touch our skin that happen throughout the day. Well, our brain does a decent job of paying particular attention to what it believes is important. And we call this selective attention. Right now, I don't know where you are listening to this lecture, but my hope is that your attention is to my voice and to the things on the screen, even if there's other stuff happening in your world right now. Maybe you've got a younger sibling running around, maybe you've got a parent that's talking in the other room, but you are able to focus in on the stimulus that is important. And what's amazing is sometimes because we focus in so much on what we believe is important, we ignore other things that are in our surroundings. Sometimes that can be dangerous if we're thinking about driving, for example, right? You're driving down the highway, you're focused on your lane and your car, and maybe the people that are right next to you, and you might completely miss someone who's about to sideswipe you from a road that's coming perpendicular to your road. And so selective attention, your ability to zero in on the stimulus that is most important. Sometimes that really helps us. Sometimes it can hurt us as well. So that's our intro to sensation and perception. We'll talk more about specific sensations in our next lecture. If you have any questions during this, reach out to me, send me an email, and good luck.